I think all of you guys know me. I'm Danielle. I do all the programming here at the Prescott Library and do all the story times. And we are very honored to welcome Tracy Chipman, who is a wonderful storyteller. If you haven't YouTubed her before or anything like that, you're in for a really special treat. And so I'm really excited to welcome Tracy to the Prescott Public Library, and I'll let her tell a little bit more about herself, because I just can't do justice for that. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Danielle. What a wonderful, warm welcome. Good morning, friends. So how lovely to come in on this sort of soft, kind of chilly, summery day. And it feels good as long as I've got enough clothing on. It was kind of a surprise, like, what do I wear? But it's a nice dilemma to have. I'm guessing we'll have some heat yet before it's all said and done and we dip into the next season, which of course will be autumn. Come on in. So let's see, just a few things. Storytelling. I'm very passionate about the power of story. I believe that it can change lives. It can connect us to our humanity. It helps us understand a deeper understanding of the mysteries in the universe. And human beings have been enjoying story and storytelling as an oral tradition, meaning not in a book, but as told from human to human for about 20,000 years. That's extraordinary when you think of it. 20,000 years, it's hard to even get your head around that large of a number that humans have been storytelling. Before there were books, before there was a printing press, before we read, we told. Okay, so it's ancient, it's in our bones, it's in our DNA. I really believe that. And I think storytelling gives you access to deepening your experience of listening. And like any skill, when you practice something, you get better and better, and your experience deepens and deepens and deepens and deepens. And that's true with listening, because we all know that sometimes our listening isn't very deep. Sometimes when we're listening to the TV or to our friends talking or our parents talking or our children talking, we may not be really listening because sometimes we're trying to do a bunch of other things. Anyone relate to that? Yeah, it's just part of being human. But to deepen our ability to listen allows a whole nother world to open up, not only in terms of relationships to each other, but a relationship to the world around us, to other cultures, other people, other ways of life, and to the beautiful natural world around us, which is always speaking to us if we are listening. Storytelling also helps you deepen your experience of your imagination. And some of you have no idea what it's like to not use your imagination. And I'm guessing some of us here perhaps aren't really sure what it means to use our imaginations anymore. Because it seems, in my experience, as we get older, we lose connection to that wild imagination, that uncolonizing of anything's possible. And I really think that's an important piece. Not only because it creates a very colorful life, but using one's imagination, I think, is very much connected to problem solving. And more than ever, we need humans, little ones and older ones, who have a connection to their wild imagination and their ability to creatively problem solve. So, with that, one more thing. I stepped on the path of Storyteller in 1995. I was a preschool teacher in Oregon State in Eugene, Oregon, where I was living at the time. And one day, my class of 14 little ones, ages 2.5 to 4.5, asked me to read the story, The Billy Goat's Gruff, for the 14th time in about 3 days. You know how that goes. And I had been curious about storytelling. It was on my radar. I'd been really connected into Celtic mythology and the whole experience of orality and telling stories. And so I decided to set the book down. I knew the story well, and I told the story without pictures, without words. And it was a very unique experience. Part of that, if you work with little ones, you know that novelty is a great motivator. But after the novelty of telling stories wore off, that same deeper engagement, involvement in the story maintained itself. It stayed. So storytelling became a really powerful part of my curriculum. And that just branched out. I work with adults, I work with college students, I tell with children, I go to memory care facilities, I do workshops, all around the conversation of story. Everything from deep, deep myth, archetypes, and the richness that deep myth can offer, to folk tales, fairy tales from around the world, to our own stories, the living history of our lives and the personal narratives that make up our lives. So, again, thank you for coming. And now, let's do some storytelling. Bring your hands together and rub them together. Rub them so fast with a little bit of pressure so you feel them warming up. Getting nice and warm. Keep warming. Faster and faster. This is called friction. And now pull them apart. And do they tingle a little bit? If you rubbed them hard enough, they will. Now scoop that energy up and bring it to your eyes so that you can see these stories with your imagination. Bring your hands to your ears so that you can hear these stories. Bring your hands to your throat so that you may tell these stories if they choose you. Bring your hands to your heart so that you can feel these stories, which is another way of listening. And then lastly, bring your hands to your belly so that you can digest these stories. Because you already know that stories are a feast, and that throughout your life you will encounter stories. Maybe they'll be written, which is the most common way that people connect with stories, but maybe they'll be told. But you'll find stories that nourish and deepen and enrich your lives. So, along with story today, before I introduce my story bell, we're doing something a little different. This summer I'm traveling around the Midwest, including storytelling and singing, which is such a great combination because you're never too old to love a story. And you're certainly never too old, welcome again, you're never too old to sing. This is my storytelling bell, and we're going to sing and warm our voices up in just a second. So this bell, which is a gift from my friend Mike, is what I ring to welcome the story in. When I'm at home and I do house concerts in people's homes, usually we open up a window and we make a little plate of food just for the stories. So this represents that. It's a welcoming the story in. Because these stories are unique and kind of troublesome, often magical creatures. So here we go. When the bell rings, then we'll invite the story in. And you'll step in to that realm of story. Once upon a time, there was a bird, and she sang and she sang and she filled the forest with sound. Once upon a time, there was a little boy, and he sang and he sang and he sang, and he filled his garden with song. Once upon a time, there was an old grandmother. And she sang and she sang, and she filled her grandchildren with songs. So bring your hands to your belly again. So we're just going to warm up our voices. Sometimes when I'm telling, then you'll make a bubble with your mouth so that no words can sneak out. But then when we're singing, you'll take the bubble out and we'll all sing together if you feel comfortable. So we're just going to put our hands on our belly and we're going to sing one sound, the sound of ma. Everyone can say that sound. Try it. Ma. Ma. Yeah, we're going to sing it 3 times into our belly. Really low. Low. Okay? And we're going to work our way up our body from our belly to our heart to our head. Starting really low. And then going a little higher. And then going all the way up to here when we get to our head. With the same sound. It's really simple, but it's kind of fun. And it warms up our bodies and it warms up our voices. And the sound ma, what does that remind you of? Anyone?
Mom.
It does. And do you know that sound ma is told throughout the world, regardless if they're speaking English or Hindi or Irish? That sound of ma all refers to mother. Okay? So hands on the belly. Take a big, deep exhale and blow it all out. Inhale. Ma. 2 more times. Ma. One more time, really low. Ma. Good job. Welcome, friends. We're just warming up our voices with some sounds. So now bring your hands to your heart. So now we're going to say the same sound, but a little higher, so not as low. So maybe something like ma. Okay. So exhale all your breath out. Inhale. Ma. 2 more times. Ma. Excellent. Now bring your hands up to the crown of your head. Now we're going to sing it really high. It doesn't have to be in pitch. Remember that. It's really important because we don't want anything to disrupt the joy of opening our mouths and making sound. So exhale everything out. Inhale. Ma. 2 more times. Ma. 1 more time with all of your voice. Ma. Wonderful. Now close your eyes. Bring your hands in your lap and just notice. Notice what you might feel inside your body from opening your mouth and making beautiful sound. Does anyone feel a little different?
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe a little more energy or more awake? Yeah. So now we're ready for a story. And let's see, the way that I work with story is that I listen to see what story wants to come. I have an idea of maybe 5 or 6 stories that I could share with you today, but until right now, I do not know what story is going to come out. Oh, and now I do. So this is a story that I first found in a book a book by a woman named Virginia Hamilton. It's about an old woman and an old man. Her name was Ms. Hattie. Ms. Hattie, she and her husband Earl lived in a little log cabin deep in the hills and hollows of West Virginia. Now, some folks would have said they didn't have very much. They just lived in a little cabin that was much smaller than this room. But they always had plenty to eat from the garden that they grew. And they had so much love in that little cabin. Some folks would say they had everything under the sun. Now, for many, many years, Earl, he worked down in town. And every day, Monday through Friday, he'd put on his big black work gloves. He worked in the rail yard. He worked on big steam engine trains. So he'd put on his big gloves and he'd kiss his wife on the cheek. And he'd say, "Have a good day, darling. Remember, you're my sunshine." And then he would wave and he would head down through the forest, through this great canopy of chestnut and sycamore. And he'd hum a little song to himself. Maybe you know this song. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. And Miss Hattie would wave. And then she'd have the day to work in the garden and do anything she wanted to do. She usually baked. Miss Hattie baked the best pies. Everyone should know how to bake a pie.
Sometimes my mom bakes apple pie.
Oh yeah, Miss Hattie loved to bake apple pies. And they had a good life. At the end of the day, Earl would come home and they would take their supper, and then they would sit down in their rocking chairs. They were old rocking chairs and they'd rock back and forth, creak, back and forth. And in the spring, they would watch the birds come back from their southern homes. They would watch the leaves unfurling in the trees. And they were happy. In the summer, they would watch the beans grow taller and the pumpkins grow fatter. And just at that time when it's neither night nor day, the Irish call it the gloaming. It's when the fairies come out. They would watch the fireflies dance and cavort in the trees and in the meadow. And in the fall, they would watch the leaves turn rust and yellow and red. And then one day just let go so easily and float down to the earth. And in the winter, well, they didn't really sit on their porch in the winter. They spent their winter inside by the fire, reading and telling stories. Well, one day Earl went down to work. He was getting old now, but he went down there every few days or so just to say hi and putter about. Technically, he was retired. And this day he put on his big work gloves and he kissed Miss Hattie on the cheek and he sang her that song. Will you help me sing it? You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. And every time Miss Hattie heard him sing that song, even if she's heard it 5,000 times, it made her heart spill and get all full and happy. And she waved goodbye to Earl. And then she went back out to the garden that just planted their seeds. And that was the last time that Miss Hattie saw Earl alive. Earl was working on a big steam engine, doing what he loved best in the world, and his old big heart just stopped. Well, you can imagine Miss Hattie, she was sad. She was so sad. And she cried and she grieved, because that's what beings do. But they had a great funeral for Earl, and they sang and they sang, and they told stories about all of Earl's adventures. And as the spring unfolded up in that little hollow where Miss Hattie lived, at night she would sit in her chair and rock back and forth. Oh, she missed Earl, and she cried. She cried every day. But she didn't feel alone. Because look, there were the geese coming back, and bluebirds. And the beans had started to come up just a bit. She didn't feel alone. She felt so a part of the world around her. Well, spring turned into summer, and Miss Hattie still missed Earl. She talked to him every day. She felt that he was with her. And maybe he was, just not in the old way. And at night she would sit in her squeaky rocking chair, squeak, and rock back and forth, back and forth. And she would watch the sunflowers dip their heads in the evening sun. She would watch those fireflies and try and count them. Sometimes she'd count 200 of them. She still missed Earl. She still cried. She still talked to him. And she didn't feel alone. She wasn't lonely. Well, you know what season comes after summer? Autumn. And Miss Hattie was busy. The garden was bigger than ever, and she sure missed Earl's help in the garden. There were beans to pick, and there were apples to pick. There was a lot to do, but Miss Hattie was busy, and after a long day, she would set her old bones down in her rocking chair. And what sound did it make? Squeak! Back and forth, squeak, she'd rock. And she'd watch the trees turning color and losing their beautiful deep green. And she felt a little chill in the air, so she put a shawl on. She still missed Earl. She still cried, sometimes. But she didn't feel alone. She was too busy. There were pumpkins, big pumpkins, and Earl used to carve those pumpkins into jack-o'-lanterns for the kids in the village, and they would come up. So she wasn't alone. But, well, you know what happens after those last leaves fall from the tree and land on the earth. And the wind takes them and makes little circles, blowing them around, and makes that sound as they skitter around the forest. And before long, it was too cold to sit in the rocking chair on the porch. Miss Hattie shut the door. And a few days after that, the first snowflake, perfect, fell from those dark, cold clouds.
It was snow.
Yeah. And Miss Hattie felt alone, shut up into that cabin. No Earl, no birds, except the occasional chickadee. No apples to pick, no garden to putter in, no fireflies. Miss Hattie, now she knew what it was like to feel alone. Well, one day she thought, well, maybe if I get some company, that would be good. I could have a little visit. So I better make a pie. Sometimes if you make a pie, company will come. It's just how it works. So Miss Hattie was digging around in her kitchen, getting all the ingredients out to make a pie. Now, Miss Hattie had her flour in a drawer. Does anyone remember flour being in their grandma's drawer?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And Miss Hattie was scooping this old chipped teacup into the flour, and she was putting in, she would make a bunch of pie dough, because you never knew when you might need to bake a pie. And as she scooped her cup into the flour drawer, she picked it up and she looked. And there in the flour, she saw 2 little black eyes looking right at her. Now, some folks are afraid of spiders, like really afraid of spiders. Some folks are really afraid of snakes. And some are really afraid of mice. Miss Hattie, she was afraid of mice. And she saw that little mouse staring right at her, its little nose sticking out of the flour, and she screamed, "Mouse!" And she jumped up on the table and she did the dance that everyone who hates mice does. And she danced on the table screaming, "Mouse! Mouse!" And I think that every mouse in the county heard her calling. And they all came running. So before long, Miss Hattie didn't just have 1 mouse for company. She had about 5 dozen. That's a lot of mice. They were running all over her place, getting into everything, tracking through the flour, making little mouse paws on the counter. And as the days and weeks went on, it got worse. Until one night, Miss Hattie was curled up in bed. She had 5 quilts piled up on top of her. It was so cold. There was a great blizzard whipping outside. And those little mice were running all over the place. They were jumping on the bed. And one of them was so bold, it ran right across her forehead. Oh, she called out, oh, Earl, wherever you are, help me. And in that moment, there was complete silence, as if even the mice were listening. And then she heard it. Someone was pounding on the door. On a night like this? Oh, who could that be? Oh, come in, said Miss Hattie, her eyes as big as saucers as that squeaky old door opened up. Standing in the doorway, Earl was standing in the doorway. Miss Hattie couldn't believe her eyes. They were as wide as dinner plates. And she watched as Earl, who had his big work gloves on, took one of those gloves off and then threw it on the floor. Miss Hattie's eyes followed that glove, and she watched as that glove began to shiver and shake and jump up and down on the floor, and then the pinky finger of the glove grew a long black tail, and the fingers and the thumb grew into little furry legs, and the opening of that glove grew into a little head with pointed black ears. And then Miss Hattie watched as that glove became a little creature, and that creature jumped up. And then it moved across the floor like liquid silk. And it jumped on the bed. And it curled itself around and around and made a little nest right in Miss Hattie's lap. Now, Some folks think that this was the very first black cat. And that little cat curled up on Miss Hattie's lap. Miss Hattie looked up. She couldn't believe this all happened in the matter of maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And she looks to the door, and the door was shut. Earl was gone. But there were 2 little wet puddles on the floor where his feet had been. And then Miss Hattie heard from across the room, squeak, squeak. And that cat pricked up its ears and pounced. Well, I bet you can guess what happened to that mouse. The whole thing, teeth, tails, nails and all, down that cat's throat. Well, after a while, Miss Hattie didn't have any trouble with mice. And guess what? She had some good company. And I bet you can guess what she named that cat.
Black cat.
What did she name the cat? Earl. And I bet you know what song she sang to that cat every morning.
You are my sunshine.
Let's sing it together. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. And Miss Hattie lived a long and wonderful life. Her and Earl too, up in that little cabin. So that's the story of Miss Hattie, Earl, and quite possibly the very first black cat. That's it. Thank you. You guys were great singing along. Did you feel how we all entered into that story together? And you know what's so interesting and unique about storytelling? Because there aren't any pictures, well, not in a book, those pictures are in your mind, in your imagination. And what you imagined or what you imagined is going to be probably different than the person sitting next to you. Because your imagination is unique to you. And yet here we are having this collective experience, sharing a story together. That's why I love stories. Individually expressive and collectively valuable stories. So, are you ready for another one?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you need to wiggle your fingers? Wiggle your fingers. Pat your head. Pat your shoulders. Pat your tummy. In fact, maybe we should sing this little song. This little song I've been singing, I've probably sang it about a dozen times this summer, and it still eludes me when I'm right here ready to, until I get going, it's kind of a little mystery. So forgive me if it's going to have a little cold start. My hope is that someone here will know this story. It's about my friend. His name is Tony Chestnut. Does anyone have a friend named Tony Chestnut?
No.
No? Okay. Well, I bet he'll be your friend after this. This is how the song goes. Toe, touch your toes. Toe, knee, chestnut, nose, I love you. Tony nose, Tony nose, Tony chestnut. Knows I love you. That's what Tony knows. Tony, Tony, and his sister Eileen. And Eileen loves Neil. And Neil loves Pat. Bob. This song is silly, but it's hip. And where it ends, you all know. Tony Chestnut Nose. Should we try that again? That's kind of fun, isn't it? Feel free to stand up if you'd like to. So, here we go. Tony Chestnut knows I love you. Tony knows, Tony knows, Tony Chestnut knows I love you. That's what Tony knows. Tony, Tony, and his sister Eileen. And Eileen loves Neil. And Neil loves Pat. But Pat still loves Bob. This song is silly, but it's hip. And where it ends, one person knows, and that's Tony Chestnut. He knows. Yay! Give yourselves a hand. Isn't that a fun song? Yeah, it's a good one. Okay, good. So now we're ready. So get your seat, your bottom settled in their seats. And we have time for, another story at least. Maybe more. Bring your hands together and rub, rub, rub. And bring your hands to your heart. And then bring your hands here and blow a bubble into the palms of your hands. And now take that bubble and put it in your mouth. I'm going to take mine out. But you keep yours in. So this is a story from Ireland. Now, Ireland has many, many stories. It's an amazing country, and it has a very rich, rich mythology and folklore. Excuse me. And the people there are very familiar with the custom of telling stories. They have a really rich connection to their oral history and their oral mythology. And there's a whole series of stories that they tell in Ireland about a great hero. Maybe you've heard of this hero. His name was Finn McCool, sometimes known as Fionn. That's how you would say it in Irish. And they believe that if a day passes without speaking Finn McCool's name, that the world will come to an end. So, we better do our part to keep the world spinning for one more day and tell the story that I'm going to share with you today. And most of the stories about Finn are about his role as a hero, as a warrior, as a king. But this is a story from when he was just a little boy. Once upon a time when stones were soft, along a great moving river, there was a castle, tall and gray. There weren't many windows in this castle. It was a fortress. And inside this castle, one evening when all the stars were shining down right into that room, there was a mother, and she was giving birth. And after hours and hours of hard work, she gave birth to a little baby boy. And she was tired, but she was so pleased to see this little one, just like you one day were born. And she held him close And she named him Finn. Finn McCool, which means Finn, son of cool. For wasn't her husband's name Cormac Cool? And she held her little one so close, and she sang this little song. Eh, nee, nee, eh, nee, nee, coddle-dee, coddle-dee, eh, nee, nee, eh, nee, nee, coddle-dee. And Finn, he closed his eyes, his little eyes, and she counted his 10 little fingers and his 10 perfect little toes. And she held him close, and he fell into a deep, sweet sleep. Well, a few days passed, and the young mother received word from a messenger that her husband, Cormac, was killed in battle. And her first thought, other than being very sad, was to protect her little baby boy. For she knew that her husband's enemies would come, and they would try and take the baby if they knew about him. So she bundled him up, even though she had just given birth to him a few days prior. She bundled him up, swaddled him tight, put him in a little basket. She sang that song to him so he would remember. Eh, nee, nee, eh, nee, nee, coddle-dee, coddle-dee. And she gave her baby boy a new name. He would always have a secret name of Finn McCool, but if people knew in the world that he was the son of Cormac, harm could come to him. So she gave him a new name, and that name was Devna. And then she handed the basket to a messenger, and the messenger took her little baby, who is now called Devna, but whose real name is deep, deep, deep into the heart of the forest, where 3 old aunties, 3 old women lived. These old women, they were not always old. Oh no, once upon a time, they had been great beauties in the court of the King of Munster. But they got fed up with that life and went to live deep in the forest so they could learn the language of nature. And little baby boy Devna arrived, and the 3 old aunties were delighted to see him. And they loved him and cared for him. And when he was old enough, they taught him many things. They taught him how to find the right flowers to make potion. They taught him how to catch a rabbit, how to skin that rabbit, how to cook that rabbit, so he would always know how to feed himself. They taught him how to bake bread, because everyone should know how to bake bread. They taught him about the sun and the stars and all the living things. They taught him to tell which was an oak tree and which was a birch, which was a hazel and which was a maple. And Finn, he gobbled it all up. He was curious. He was so curious. He wanted to know about everything in the world, just like you. And when he turned 10, double digits, the 3 old aunties said, "Now, Devna, it's time for you to leave us. It's time for you to go deeper into the forest, along a great and powerful river called the River Boyne and live and learn from a poet. You see, poetry was the only language that the three aunties couldn't teach Devna. But there was somebody, this old bard, a poet, great poet. His name was Fingal. And old Fingal, he lived deep in the forest, and Fingal was eccentric. He was weird in all the best ways. And old Fingal agreed to take young Devna in and teach him the language of poetry, which is also a language of nature. Well, you see, old Fingal, he had been doing the strangest thing. For the last 7 years, every day, he went fishing. It's not that he loved fishing, but he had a reason. You see, 7 years prior, he had a dream. And in his dream, a person named Finn caught the salmon of all knowledge. You see, in the River Boyne, there lives a salmon who eats the magic hazelnuts that fall into the river and now possesses all the knowledge in the universe. And in the dream that Fingal saw, that somebody named Finn caught the salmon and ate it. And when they ate it, they possessed all the knowledge in the universe. Now, old Fingal, this is a little tricky, but stay with me. Old Fingal thought he was Finn, for didn't his friends call him Finn? His name was spelled Fingal. They called him Old Finn sometimes. So he thought he was the Finn. So every day he went out to try and catch this tricky fish, because who wouldn't want all the knowledge in the universe? And every day he came home empty-handed. Oh, sometimes he caught a bluegill or a little trout, but he could never catch this clever, crafty salmon. So I bet you can guess on Devna's first day with Fingal what they did. They went fishing. But first, old Fingal made a fire. No matches, no lighter, just some dry leaves and a stone or two. He made a little fire and he said, "We must have tea." "Welcome, young Devna. You are very welcome. I can tell that we'll get along famously and have great fun together learning the language of poetry. Learning to use majestic language to color the inexpressible." Well, Devna wasn't really sure what that all meant, but he was happy to be here. And he drank his tea. And as soon as they were finished, old Fingal said, "Right, now we're going fishing, my lad. Come on." And down to the river they went. And he had a whole can of worms, and they hooked the worms on a little hook, and they threw the line into the river. And they waited. And they waited. And for some reason, as Devna stood against the river, moving downstream, he remembered a little snatch of a song. Hey, nee, nee, hey, nee, nee, ka-da-lee-dee, ka-da-lee-dee. Do you want to help me? Hey, nee, nee, hey, nee, nee, ka-da-lee-dee, ka-da-lee-dee. And Devna, sometimes when he was very quiet and very still, he remembered this song, but he could not remember who sang it to him. And then he was brought back from his daydream about that song because something was tugging on his fishing line. And they watched as this big silver salmon pulled against the hook, flying out of the river. And old Fingal said, "Pull it in, my boy, pull it in." So he pulled in the fishing line, and they brought the fish up onto the shore. And old Fingal was just so excited, he caught the fish. This was the salmon. This was the magic salmon that possessed all the knowledge in the universe. And old Fingal knelt down next to the fish, and he said a blessing. Maraha, marava, marabias, gubra. And he thanked the fish, and he thanked the river, and he thanked Devna. And then he clunked the fish over the head with a rock. And that was it. Oh, laddie, we'll have this fish cooking in no time. Let's bring it back to the fire. So they brought it back to the fire, which was now just a nice hot bed of coals, perfect to cook a fish. And they set it next to the coals. And then Fingal said, "Right, now I'm going into the forest to find us some sorrel, some plants, some herbs, some mushrooms, and some nuts that I'll stuff into the salmon, and we will have a feast." Or he said, well, maybe I just will have a feast, because he knew that this was the salmon that possessed all the knowledge in the universe, and that he was the one that would be able to eat it. He said to Devna, "Whatever you do, don't touch this fish. Don't touch it." Devna nodded. And so he sat there by the fire and he just watched the fish. And old Fingal, he skipped off into the forest with a little basket, singing to himself. And Devna watched the fish and he looked around. And then he noticed the fish was starting to smell really good. He was getting hungry, but he promised not to touch it. And he kept his word. He was, even then, a young man of honor. But then he noticed that the fish was starting to burn. The tail end of it was a little close to the hot coals. And he knew that if he didn't do something soon, the fish would burn and it would become inedible. So, being the clever lad that he was, young Devna, whose name is really, found a stick, a good stout stick. It had a nice pointed edge. And he tried to move the fish away from the hot coals so it wouldn't burn. That wasn't touching it. He didn't think so, anyways. But the pointed end of the stick pierced, it punctured that cooked flesh of the salmon. And a great stream of hot grease went flying. And it landed right on Devna's thumb, burning it. Hot grease burns. What do you think Devna did with that thumb? Anyone? Yes. He didn't go run to the river. He went right into his mouth. In fact, that's why they say we have wisdom teeth to this day. But that's another story for another day. In that moment, if you would have been a leaf or a bug or a rabbit watching, you would have seen Devna's eyes get wide. You would have seen him looking up in awe at the world around him. And that's how old Fingal found him. He came trotting back from the forest, his basket overflowing with sorrel and asphodel and wild thyme and some mushrooms and some acorns. And he didn't even notice. He was so excited. He'd finally caught the fish. Well, Devna had caught the fish, but it was his fish. Hadn't he worked so hard for 7 years to catch this fish? And now it had been caught. And he was so excited. And so he didn't even notice Devna sitting there, staring. So he gathered up his herbs and he stuffed them in to the salmon's belly, a slit in his belly, and packed it full of these herbs. It would need to cook for just a few more minutes, and then they would take it off and let it sit and let all that goodness infuse the salmon with the loveliest taste. Well, he pulled it off the fire and they sat, and of course old Fingal gave a long blessing, blessing the fish again, blessing Devna for catching it, blessing the river. A blessing was a way of being thankful, of praising the fish for giving its life to be food and nourishment. And in this case, a fish that possessed all the knowledge in the universe. And he goes, now, young Devna, I'd like to give you some of this fish to eat, but I don't know if I can. I'll eat some first, and if there's any left, I'll share it with you. And if there isn't any left, we'll make sure that you get another cup of tea very soon. And so Devna pulled a piece of the fish, or not Devna, old Fingal pulled a piece of the fish and started to eat. He didn't need silverware. And he started to eat, and he waited. And you'd think if you ate the salmon of knowledge, you would know. Right? But nothing changed. In fact, old Fingal had a question that's been burning a hole in his heart for years. What is the music of what is? And he ate the salmon, and no answer came. What is the source of a rainbow? He asked. No answer. He ate more fish. He ate more fish. Still, he had all these questions and no answers. And that's when he looked over at Devna, still sitting pie-eyed, looking at everything. And he looked at Devna and he goes, "Did you touch this fish?" "No," said Devna. "I didn't touch it." And he took another bite. Nothing. And he said, "Did you touch this fish?" Devna said, "Well, not exactly." What? What happened? Tell me. Well, Devna said, "Well, the fish was burning, and I promised not to touch it. So I had to do something, or it would have just burned, and you'd had nothing to eat. So I found a stick, and I was going to move the fish out of the way." "Yes," said Fingal. And the stick poked into the cooking fish, and a great stream of grease went flying up into the air. "Yes," said Fingal. "And it landed on me tongue. And well, I put it in my mouth." "Ugh," said Fingal. "So you didn't touch the fish, but you still managed to get some into your gob." "Yes," said Devna. And he said, looking at Devna with his beady old eyes that were very wise. And he said, "Your name's not really Devna, is it?" And Devna said, "No." "What's your name?" And Devna stood up, proud, and he said, "My name, my real name is Finn McCool." And old Fingal, he sat back. Finn McCool. "So you're the Finn that I had the dream about. What a fool I've been. I thought the dream was about me." And he explained the dream and the salmon, because that dream wasn't about me. I'm not the Finn. You are the Finn. And he laughed, but he was disappointed, but he also saw that he had made a mistake. He had made a mistake. And he said, it's okay. It's right. Better a young person be gifted with all the knowledge of the universe than some old codger like me. But you'll stay with me, young Devna, young Finn, and you'll teach me a few things and answer some of the questions that have been burning a hole in me for the last 7 years. And maybe I'll teach you a few things as well. And so it was. For the next 7 years, Finn McCool lived with old Fingal. And they told stories, and they wrote poetry, and they answered questions. And of course, that one question that young Devna, young Finn had wanted to know, who sang that song? He knew. He remembered. Didn't his own mother sing him that song? And at night, under the stars, him and old Fingal, before he fell into his snore fest of sleep, would sing to each other. Eh, nee, nee, eh, nee, nee, ka-da-lee-dee, ka-da-lee-dee, eh, nee, nee, eh, nee, nee, ka-da-lee-dee, ka-da-lee-dee. So that's the story of Finn McCool and the salmon of knowledge. Shinagate, which means that's it. Thank you so much. I bet you didn't know you would be singing an Irish song today, did you? No. So our time is up. That hour went like that. So now you have some stories and some songs to take you into the day. And maybe over the next few days, you'll remember a part of the story that you really liked or that troubled you. And that's where you maybe want to spend a little time thinking about that story and that scene or that image, because there's a gift there for you. And if any one of these stories sits in your heart and builds a nest, maybe you'll tell one of these stories, the story of Ms. Hattie, or the story of Finn McCool, or sing one of these songs. And I hope that you do, for we are all story carriers. And most of us, whether we know it or not, are storytellers. Thank you so much for inviting me to Prescott. It was a delight. Put one hand out, turn it over, and give yourselves a pat on the back for your great, deep listening. All of you. That's extraordinary. Put both hands out, turn them over, and give yourselves a big hug. A hug, a hug for your wild, uncolonized imaginations. Have a lovely day and a lovely rest of your summer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.